Megan Lewis, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, I haven't finished my mental preparation, so I'm quite. So maybe in one, two, or three questions I will have my. Okay,
You'll
I
get into the
kind of
flow of it.
I got into the flow of it. So yeah, first of all, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Megan Lewis. I'm an Assyriologist, so I specialize in the history and culture of ancient Mesopotamia, which is mostly modern day Iraq. I do a lot of public education, public outreach, so I do lectures for schools occasionally. I have a couple of podcasts that I use to kind of share information about the ancient world with people who aren't themselves academics. Um, so there's a Digital Hammurabi, which is my main baby, if you will, my own creative project. I do a podcast called the Misquoting Jesus with Dr. Bart Ehrman that focuses on New Testament history and early Christianity, and the Reading Party podcast that I do with a friend, Alexi Henning. So we look at the reception of the ancient world in film, media, books, TV, all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the podcasting YouTube side of things. I also, with my husband, publish um, books about the ancient world, about the Old Testament, aimed at, again, non-specialists. So trying to take academic information and distill it down and make it accessible to people who haven't been to grad school, don't have the time or the money to do so, but are still very interested in finding reliable, trustworthy information about the ancient world and maybe struggle to do that. And we also do some online courses. We've just started doing those. So we do Hebrew, biblical Hebrew language classes, Middle Egyptian. We're doing Sumerian in the new year as well. And we've got currently running an Egyptian introduction to Egyptian mythology class with a friend of ours, Dr. Jill Waller, who's an Egyptologist.
Why is the name Digital Hammurabi? What does it mean?
Um, it comes from a course that I put together while I was a grad student, and I never actually got the opportunity to teach it. We did try running it, but there wasn't enough interest. So it was called Hammurabi in a Digital Age. So looking at the intersection of ancient worlds, Mesopotamia, and digital technologies, and how you can use new technologies to kind of augment and improve our understanding of different parts of the ancient world. So I had this course in the back of my mind when we decided to create our YouTube channel, and we thought, oh, great, Digital Hammurabi. It kind of encapsulates the modern approach that we're taking, but still retains a link to a very recognizable link to ancient Mesopotamia. And then about a year and a half after we started Digital Hammurabi, we found out there was actually already something called Digital Hammurabi, which was a project run out of Johns Hopkins University, which is where both my husband and I attended. And that was a kind of like a digitization of cuneiform digital project, which isn't running and wasn't running when we started our Digital Hammurabi, but it was a little bit odd to find, oh, this already exists and is a fantastic lesson for why you should always Google a business name before you go ahead and start the business.
So actually, how much do we know about the Hammurabi as a person?
A pretty good amount. We have letters between him and other kings of the time, so we know about his kind of political activity. We know some about his personal life because that's all kind of referenced in the letters, and we have a large amount of inscriptions. Obviously, the Law Stele of Hammurabi is the most famous one that comes to mind. So we have lots of inscriptions that tell us what he was doing, but also what he wanted people to remember him for. Um, so yeah, I'd say as far as ancient kings go, he's well attested.
Okay. I want to ask the nerdy question first. So yeah, I'm your stereotypical type of you know people that loves to browse history videos in YouTube, and being a skeptic myself, I encounter Bart Ehrman first before I know you, where I find his podcast where you are interviewing him, misquoting Jesus. So how does it feel to interview him? And at one time you were interviewed by him also. How did it feel?
It's a lot of fun. I enjoy interviewing people generally it's what I do most of the time on Digital Hammurabi. I'm interviewing different academics about their work. I find it really interesting to learn more about people's specializations. And talking with Bart is always, it's so much fun. He's a really good person to interview because he's so experienced in it. He can really take a question and give a very full but not rambling answer, but still leave lots of room for you to ask follow-up questions. He's an absolutely wonderful person. I really enjoy talking to him.
So about you being interviewed by him, how did it feel?
I don't much like being interviewed. It unsettles me quite a lot. I don't like talking about myself. But it was good, actually. Bart very kindly let me look at the questions before we spoke, so I knew what was coming. It was really nice to be able to share in a bit more depth what I do in my professional life with the audience of Misquoting Jesus, because most of them quite rightly have no idea who I am. I'm just the person who talks to Bart every week. So it was fun to be able to kind of show that actually I have a speciality, I have a career of my own that intersects with what I do with Bart, but is actually in a completely different area of history.
So yeah, there is another way. There is another way that I found you. It was a podcast you did maybe in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, with Derek from Mythvision. So most people know you as the wife of Dr. Josh, because since he's as a scholar that touches a lot about the issue of Old Testament. So he become more popular than that. But I did find you in an interview with Derek, where one of the moment that I remember was when you had your kids crying in the back, and one of them tried to ask you something, and then you try to keep your composure and then continue the interview while the kids crying in the background. I think that experience is quite hilarious. I do stumble a lot of that kind of experience too, since I have two kids. But why did you choose to keep the section going?
We have 5 children in the house, and the youngest are 3. We have 3-year-old twins. We have a 6-year-old, 10-year-old, and a nearly 18-year-old. So it's very difficult for me to do any kind of work without there also being a child kind of around in the background somewhere, especially at the time when that interview was recorded. Oliver was not even 1, I don't think, and Piper would have been 5. We didn't have daycare. The 2 little ones weren't in school, so they were just home with me. And it's either you kind of accept the fact that there are going to be interruptions and you keep going with it because that's life, or you get really, really stressed and frustrated with it and try and make it perfect. And it's easier on my blood pressure to accept that there are just going to be children interrupting you, and that's okay. That's something that just is part of life, than try and fight it, really.
Do you find it hard to balance your work and your caring for kids?
Yes, very much. Josh works full-time outside the house, as well as doing all of the writing and the research and the podcasts that he does for Digital Hammurabi. The children are mostly in school or daycare now, but the 2 youngest are quite severely asthmatic, so they have a lot of time off school, especially in the winter, which means that I spend a lot of time rearranging recordings or pushing my own deadlines further back, because I have children at home, and when they're that young and they're both at home, it's very, very difficult to really get anything done, even just sitting down and typing, because the instant I sit down, I get a small child sitting on my lap and they want to type, which is adorable, but not helpful for writing your own work. So I would say that it's our output has definitely decreased in the past couple of years. It's getting easier now as they get older and they're more able to either entertain themselves or stay in school because they're not sick anymore, I can actually sit down and really make some inroads into the mountain, the massive backlog of stuff that I have that I want to get done. But it's difficult. It's very difficult to balance.
Okay. Yeah, good to know because I find it difficult as well, especially when I have two boys and they are quite um they cannot sit calmly. They always I'm lucky to have this interview at 11 in midnight here in Indonesia, so they're already sleeping. But if I do this in, say, let's 8 or 9 a.m. in the morning, there will be chaos basically.
Yep.
So
No,
yeah.
it's difficult. And when if Josh has interviews, they're typically after the kids are in bed or they're on the weekends. And if he has a weekend interview, I do everything I can to just take the children out of the house, because if they're home and they know he's upstairs, they're going to try and break into the recording area, because they want to say hello to whoever it is Daddy's talking to on the computer, which is lovely. Again, we love having them involved, but it's not it's not terribly helpful when you're trying to actually be productive.
Okay. Yeah, cool. So let's talk about YouTube history channels. What is your personal take on the historical YouTube channels? Do you think the information provided by the channels could be used as a trusted reference for knowledge?
I think it depends very much on the channel itself. There are a lot out there that are either produced by people who are trained archaeologists, trained classicists. They've gone through all the like professional rigorous training that you need, or they're very, very knowledgeable. I don't want to say amateurs, but they're knowledgeable non-professionals who have spent a long time doing a lot of very in-depth, thorough research. I think Derek from Mythvision actually would be a fantastic example of that. He's not a trained biblicist, but he knows an awful lot. Same with Paulogia. Not a trained biblicist, knows a hell of a lot about New Testament studies, about Old Testament. And frankly, I would trust anything that either of them put out to be academically sound. There are, however, a lot of other channels where people are maybe repeating their own personal theories that either aren't grounded in historical fact or any kind of evidence, or they're repeating things that maybe someone told them once and they think that that just sounds like a nice idea. And it's very difficult sometimes to differentiate between people who know what they're talking about and have done the research and people who don't, but sound very, very confident and very knowledgeable. It's really hard to do. And I think that's one of the reasons why with digital Hammurabi especially, we try to either put references in our video description so people can see, oh, this is where this information comes from, provide solid examples from ancient texts or from archaeological evidence in the videos themselves, and be very clear when what we're saying is either our personal views or something that is maybe not accepted by mainstream archaeology or mainstream academia.
Do you have any other YouTube creators that you can suggest for us aside from Paulogia or Mythvision or Digital Hammurabi?
Yeah, Religion for Breakfast. Andrew Mark over there does a fantastic job. We've also got Dig It with Raven, I think. Raven De Silva, she's an archaeologist. She does a fantastic job. Anything by Flint Dibble, again, he's an archaeologist. Fantastic information there. There are loads of others, but I don't watch a lot of YouTube myself unless it's like teaching me how to fix something.
Yeah.
I do a lot of DIY YouTube. But there are some fantastic people out there. I think the key thing when you're looking for historical information is try and find a channel that is either affiliated with a museum or a university or an academic press or something like that. Or if it's a personal YouTube channel, find one that is either providing references for the theories that they're kind of the theories they're explaining, or find someone who has training and specifically training in the field that they're talking about. Because something that you find a lot, especially with biblical studies, is people will get a PhD in a related field, say Egyptology, Assyriology, and then they have the weight of being a doctor, but then they'll go and they'll talk exclusively about the historicity of the Old Testament, which is not what they're trained in. So that can be a little bit tricky. So definitely if you're browsing by yourself and you're not sure if you can trust someone, just do a bit of digging into who they are. Are they a professional academic? Have they had academic training? And what have they had their training in?
What are the qualities of Paulogia and their that they have that makes them quite um, a very reliable source for a history of, or history in general? What are their qualities?
I think they're both interested just in history as people. It's something that interests them. Um, they are very open and honest about themselves not being specialists. They both consult with specialists on a very regular basis. They have interviews, they have people coming on their channels and giving academic consensus, helping to explain things that they maybe don't have the background or the knowledge to do. But they're very upfront about the fact that actually they're not historians. You never catch either of them saying, well, I'm a historian, I know what I'm talking about. It's always, this is what I found in my own research, this is where I found it, and these are some people that either agree with me or can provide more information for you.
Do you think if in the future there are more creators like them, um, it could be a lot easier for historians like you to give reference to? I mean, if there are if you have students asking you about something that you find a creator like them provide in their YouTube videos, so would you direct your students to see their YouTube videos?
I think that very much depends on if the student is looking for what I would consider like more casual viewing, or if they're looking for like research materials for writing a paper or something similar. I think YouTube definitely has a place in disseminating information to people who aren't specialists. I think that's a really, really important job. And I think that's primarily what Derek and Paul are engaged in doing. Neither of them are pretending to be academic resources. They're resources for people who want to know about the academic understanding of something, but don't want to go to university, don't want to dive into academic literature themselves. And I don't blame them. Academic literature is very, very dense. If a student was asking me for something that they could watch to deepen their own understanding of a topic that had, I don't know, been covered in class, or to start exploring a topic that they were interested in as a potential avenue for future study, I think what I would be recommending is something like professional lectures that have been recorded. So something put out by a university or by a museum. Lots of museums have fantastic podcasts or lectures available online. And I think that's probably more what I would be directing people to, specifically for the study of ancient history.
Okay. Let's talk about Josh first. Yeah, one of the superstar of YouTube atheism that delves in history. Yeah. Okay. And I'm not trying to compare you with Josh because yeah, you have different expertise, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yes. So we're both Assyriologists. His PhD is ancient Near Eastern studies. He specialized in the Sumerian language. I didn't end up getting my PhD. I left early, but both of my master's degrees are ancient Near Eastern studies also. So our training is similar. He has a much more extensive background in Hebrew Bible. Before he went to Hopkins, he was a pastor for several years, and he has a master's of theology, which involved a lot of biblical, obviously biblical study, but also Koine Greek and biblical Hebrew. So what he does online is much more in the counter-apologetics field. He's taking the Hebrew Bible, he's taking the claims people make about it, and looking at, okay, this is the claim. Does it actually hold up under scrutiny? Is this what the text is actually saying? How do we know whether or not it's accurate? And then kind of sharing that information with people who don't have training in Hebrew. So he definitely, a lot of his public work is definitely much more focused around combating bad information about the Bible, and showing people good resources to use and explaining to people how to think a bit more critically about the claims that are being made about what is essentially an ancient text.
So, yeah. If he's popular because of his works in counter-apologetics, if you were to have that kind of popularity as well, what topics that you're going to be popular of?
Ugh, I don't know. Um, uh, if I was going after popularity, I think I'd probably spend a lot more time talking about ancient aliens, and do kind of a counter apologetic for ancient alien type stuff, because there's a lot of very, very bad information, especially surrounding the Sumerian language, because it's not so well known as some of the other ancient languages. So people feel free to make very strange claims about what an ancient text does or doesn't say, because it's so difficult to find an accurate English translation, an accurate modern translation. That's actually got much easier in recent years with the creation of online resources like the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, which has translations of if not all, a large percentage of Sumerian literary texts. But people who aren't specialists already don't tend to know about those resources. They're not very easy to find. So if they pick up a book by someone like Zecharia Sitchin, there aren't then, as you see with classics, there aren't then like 50 English translations of all of the texts that Sitchin cites. So it's difficult for people to go back and actually see, okay, this just doesn't say what he says it does. So if I was seeking popularity, I think that's probably the area that I would spend more time in. It's necessary. I think someone needs to do it, because it's like I said, very hard to find reliable information and people explaining to you why these arguments don't hold up if you look at the actual languages. Yeah.
Why do people think it's alien?
Um, in some instances, it's because they don't necessarily understand what the stories themselves are doing. In some instances, it's because they're racist, for want of a better word, because it's white people can do all kinds of amazing things. They can write amazing literature, and look at Stonehenge. It's obviously made by white people, but then you get to the pyramids and the ziggurats, and suddenly it's, oh no, it can't have been the brown people living there, because they're just not capable. They didn't have the technology. It must have been aliens. And people don't necessarily realize that that's where some of these ideas come from, but that's where a lot of them come from. It's an old kind of 18th, 19th century belief that actually people of non-European descent are just simply not capable of doing the things that they clearly, based on history, did. So it must have been aliens. And I think in some cases it's a really fun idea. It's so much more, for some people, so much more exciting to think about aliens coming down to the planet and having this kind of contact and doing all these amazing, incredible things. And maybe one day they'll come back. I personally am more interested in the fact that ancient people did this, and why did they do it, and what were they trying to express, and what function did all of these things serve within their society. I think that's far more fascinating. But that's why I'm an historian and not a science fiction novelist.
Okay, but yeah, my next question is, what does it mean for someone to be a historian, and what's the difference between a historian and, say, like, archaeologist?
An historian is someone, so obviously someone who's involved in the study of history. It tends to carry a connotation of reading ancient or reading documentation. So I'm an Assyriologist, not a Near Eastern archaeologist. That means that my speciality is in reading the texts that were left behind by these ancient people. Archaeology is the practice or the science of excavating and interpreting material remains left by past civilizations, past cultures. So archaeologists are much more caught up in the physical aspect of things. Historians tend to be more into the writing and the reading. That gets a bit blurred, obviously, because the two intersect an awful lot. The texts you uncover can help to inform you as to what's going on in a specific place, but at the same time, the texts themselves are archaeological artifacts, and that's really, really clear in Mesopotamia, because they're written on clay and they're incised in stone, and it's not this kind of ephemeral piece of paper. They're big, they're solid, and they're objects. They're archaeological objects, all of their own. So you get a lot of intersection and the two disciplines kind of working back and forth and together to get a deeper understanding of the ancient past.
So, what is Assyriology, and what are the scopes? I mean, I heard words a lot like Mesopotamia, Babylonia, and Near East, and something like that. What are the differences?
So Assyriology is the study of ancient Mesopotamia. So that's ancient Iraq, parts of what's known as the periphery. So maybe parts of Iran, parts of Turkey, the Levant. Egypt kind of comes into it as well, because we have a large corpus of cuneiform texts. Cuneiform is the script that was used by Mesopotamian cultures to write. We have a large cache of cuneiform texts in Egypt. So you kind of get Assyriologists working on those texts which were found in Egypt and relate to Egyptian culture. But so that's very interesting. So yes, the study of the languages and cultures of ancient Mesopotamia. The ancient Near East more broadly is used to designate Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, so modern Turkey, Syria, Palestine, kind of Iran, Iraq, and Syria. No, I said Syria, I think. So that whole kind of area would be considered ancient Near East. It gets kind of subdivided. So if you're a biblical archaeologist or you're a Syro-Palestinian archaeologist, you're looking at the Levantine coast, as opposed to Mesopotamian archaeology, which is looking at like what's known as the Fertile Crescent, the area between and around the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. If you're getting into more specific geographical terms, like Assyria, Babylonia, Sumer, Assyria and Babylonia are essentially North Mesopotamia and South Mesopotamia. And the terms kind of originate in when we're talking about empires. So when you've got the Babylonian Empire, the area ruled by like the Babylonian heartland is what we would know as Babylonia. So it's southern Mesopotamia. Assyria is the same, but for the Assyrian Empire. And Sumer is roughly congruent with Babylonia. It's the southern section of Mesopotamia, kind of around the Persian Gulf.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question that sounds ignorant, but when did ancient Assyria stop being ancient? What time in history?
So Assyriology tends to stop with the end of cuneiform writing, which is like 140 AD, I think, is the latest cuneiform text. By that point, it wasn't really... the area wasn't ruled by native people anymore. We'd had Persians invade, Greeks invade. I think the Romans at that point had invaded. So it was very much not the primary mode of communication or of writing. Aramaic kind of took over before that. But I think the last cuneiform text we have is 140-ish. So that's really kind of the cutoff for Assyriology. And then the beginning is, I think, the mid-4th millennium BCE. You get the first cuneiform texts, but whether or not they actually represent language is a bit of a debate. There's no grammar that we can really see, but it's the first kind of cuneiform writing, the first use of those signs to denote some kind of meaning.
3,500 years. So that's the scope of what you learn.
Hmm.
Doesn't Have you ever feel overwhelmed by a very big time frame
Yes,
for?
absolutely. And you will find if anyone goes into Assyriology, what you tend to do is specialize in either a particular time period or a geographical location or a specific corpus of materials. So I have friends who work exclusively in Neo-Assyrian scientific texts. That is their specialty. That's what they're interested in. And that's what they spend their time and their energy on. You will have people who do um, maybe more broadly Akkadian literature, which is a pretty big time frame, but the variation is a little less because there's a very strong tradition of continuity within the literary culture of Mesopotamia. We'll have people working on omen texts or personal letters, or maybe even the reign of one king. So it is quite overwhelming when you first start, but you're very much encouraged to find something that is really sparking your interest and pursue that. People obviously can switch around, and they do switch around when they feel they've reached the end of a particular research interest. But that's how you typically will start out.
Yeah, I kind of think I don't know. I'm not a historian, and yeah, I think I imagine people that they're considering to continuing their education, and I start to think something like, you know what, I'm going to be a historian, specifically learn about this specific time frame in 3005, between 3000 and 500, and I
Mm-hmm.
choose to learn a very specific kind of writing, or maybe a specific kind of culture that we don't have a lot of data about. I think it takes a lot of inspiration to choose those kind of persuasion, especially when you want to become a professional in that field. Um, yeah, I still trying to figure out those historian things. But what makes you interested in Assyriologist?
Well, I
Assyriology.
wanted to be a classicist when I went through my undergraduate degree. I wanted to study classical Greek mythology. And when I got to write my undergraduate thesis, I wanted to do a comparison between Mesopotamian and classical Greek myth, because there are a lot of really interesting parallels there. And the advisor that I was assigned to was the Assyriologist for the ancient history department at my university. And I very much enjoyed working with him. I got a lot out of it, both academically and personally. He was a delightful man, Dr. Alistair Livingstone. And when I was kind of reaching the end of my dissertation, he said, Megan, what are you planning on doing after this? And I said, well, I want to be a classicist. And his response was essentially, you could do that. You'd be a great classicist, but have you considered Assyriology? There's so much in classics that has already been translated and been worked through. In Assyriology, we have so many texts that just haven't been looked at properly yet. And I think that would be a really productive area for you. And I had so enjoyed working with him, and I'd, over the course of my undergraduate degree, taken several Mesopotamian history classes and really enjoyed those as well. And I thought, you know what, this sounds like a great idea. So I did my first master's degree with him. Still really enjoyed it, still loved it. So then I went on to start my PhD and get my second master's. And I think what fascinates me is it's the same really as with anyone who researches a specific culture. It's the sheer variety and breadth of human experience that you can access through the archaeology, through reading these texts. And what I find really interesting, yes, there are differences, but there are so many points of commonality between the ancient world and the modern world. Our concerns are the same, our worries are the same, the things that we really want to put our energies and our effort into are the same. And I find that just really, really interesting. So better understanding kind of where those concerns come from, how they surface, how they're expressed, and then just seeing how people relate to each other and the world around them. It's absolutely wonderful. I love it.
What are their concerns in the past that's still relevant for us today?
Um, family,
Mm.
trying to control your environment, trying to control your destiny, I guess, in a very unpredictable, very changeable world. I think a lot of people today feel a very deep sense of lack of control over what is happening in the world at large, but also in their own lives. And you see that in the ancient world all the time. It's why people sacrifice to the gods. It's why the Mesopotamian cultures had such a strong tradition of omens and prophecy, because they're trying to understand what's going on in the world. How can I influence it? How can I protect myself and my family and my people from the negative impacts of whatever it is happening? And then at the same time, um, you've got this really strong drive to better understand why humans are here, what we're supposed to be doing, and this comes through really strongly in the Epic of Gilgamesh for anyone who's read it, how to cope with that human mortality. It, we're all going to die. It's a fact of life, and no one particularly likes the idea. No one's, well, few people are looking forward to it, especially, and seeing that come through so strongly in literary characters from several thousand years ago, and seeing them grapple with the crippling grief of losing a friend and trying to work out what they do now and how they keep going, and how they come to terms with, well, this is going to happen to me, is absolutely fascinating. Humans are humans throughout time and across all different cultures. And I think that emphasizing these similarities and exploring them further and telling other people about them, I think really can help to maybe not remove distrust of strangers and of cultures that are very different to our own, but create a sense of curiosity rather than fear.
If there's any lesson that you can take from the ancient Assyria, and then you share to the masses of people right now, what would you give?
Um, don't piss off the gods. Pretty solid advice. In all seriousness, I think
I hope
I
it's not a hard
think
question for you.
no, it's just it's interesting to think about. I think one of the things that I find comforting at the moment is the ability of humanity to endure and to change and to adapt to challenging situations. And it's when you study Mesopotamian history, it's often taught as this series of unifications and then the splitting apart of an empire. One particularly strong ruler will kind of round everyone up and conquer a bunch of other places and make this single political entity, and that might last for 100 years or so. But ultimately, everything kind of fragments again. And it can be, I've heard it described by non-academics usually as like the inherently warlike nature of the Middle East. I'm like, that's absolute bullshit. That's not what's going on here. I mean, for goodness sake, look at European history. It's not exactly a path of roses. It's people fighting and conquering each other. Just they're white, so it's okay. Sorry, apparently I'm on a on a bit of a rant at the moment. But if you look at the fact that yes, all of these things happen, yes, there's a lot of upheaval, yes, there's a lot of change, but by and large, people endure. They live their lives, they do their best, they raise their children, and they find moments of joy when they can. And I think that sense of endurance, that sense of adaptation is really, really useful and reassuring.
So, I think in some sense, the people in the past in controlling, try to make sense of the unknown and try to control their lives. They struggle with it, right? I think people in nowadays still have the same problem of make sense of the world. I think most people, especially for millennials and especially Gen Z, I'm a millennial, Gen Z, like most of my friends nowadays, they struggle to find some sense in their life. And if we try to look back to the ancient times, I think they struggled the same problem too. Um, at least by my observation, if the past is struggle to try to control the environment, we struggle to control our own life and how we manage to 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 live our life with ever changing society. Um, I know that most of the ancient people didn't anticipate this kind of problem, right? We have very different problems, but if there is one lesson that you can give on how to make sense of our life nowadays from the ancient people, um, what is it?
Oh, that is a good question. I think, and I don't know if this is necessarily making sense of the world, but I think the best lesson is to live the best life you can. And I think you see that really strongly in Gilgamesh, because when the epic opens, he is an absolute terror. He's terrorizing his city. He is challenging all the men to fights. He's assaulting the women. And by the end of the epic, he's lost his best friend. He's lost his one shot at immortality. He's traveled the world, and he ends up right back where he started. But he returns as a very different person, and he returns as someone who is going to live the best life he can, because this is it. And it's framed in Gilgamesh, it's framed a little differently, I think, than how many modern people would frame it, because it's framed as live your best life, by which I mean do the things that society expects of you, like be a good king, be a good son, be a good husband, honor the gods, because that is how you will be remembered after you're gone. I'm not sure modern people are necessarily as concerned with being remembered, but I do think that this idea of live your best life, don't go around terrorizing people, like have some basic empathy, I think is really a very good lesson that I think many people should be bearing in mind.
So there's a lot of empathy going on in ancient times. Yeah. What I always know about the ancient people, especially the Middle East, they're always, yeah, like you said, warlike. But having heard this from you, I start to change my mind a little bit. That actually they are wise people. They think a lot about life.
I think certainly a lot of them do, and I don't want to generalize, because like you said earlier, we're talking about nearly 4,000 years of history, many different cultures. So there are obviously very significant variations in what I'm saying. And if you look at the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the drive to go on yearly military campaigns was very real and was framed as a religious duty, essentially. So yes, I would say that the Neo-Assyrian kings were extremely warlike. I think that the danger lies in looking at broad swathes of history and using it to draw generalizations, like essential generalizations about all of the people who have always lived there. And when we're looking at history, especially ancient history, what we're looking at is, especially when we're looking at textual evidence, we're looking at what the most powerful people have written. And again, looking at the Neo-Assyrians, those are the kings. What we're looking at is their war reports, their prayers to the gods, asking them to be victorious in battle. their threats to other kings and other nations, saying, if you don't send us tribute, we're going to come and wipe you out. And I don't think that is necessarily a good reflection of everybody in the new Assyrian Empire. That's how the political machine at the time worked. And I think that when you start looking at things like literary texts, you start looking at personal letters between people who are not royal and not elite, you see very similar concerns to the ones that we have today. There's a collection of letters from a site in southern Turkey that were written by non-elite merchant families. And a lot of those letters are from women who are living in Mesopotamia. Their husbands have gone north to establish a trading colony. And a lot of the letters are from these women saying, when are you coming home? Like, I'm here with all the children. I don't have any money left. Your creditors are knocking at my door. You haven't been to the temple. When are you coming home? Like, this need to have familial support, to have your spouse with you, to raise your children well. They're just people trying to live and live as best they can.
I have one more serious question for you before we go to a more fun question. So yeah, let's start again. It's 48:10. Okay. So how much your historical knowledge changed your worldview?
That's a good question. I think it's made it much broader. I think that I have a much greater appreciation for the variety of cultures. Growing up in the Western world, you get very myopic. There is Europe and there is ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And for me as a British person, there's like the Tudors and the Vikings and that segment of history. And not necessarily through the schools, but just through the culture, you get this idea that there was Greece and there was Rome and then there was modern Europe, and fantastic. That's all there is to it. So having this much broader understanding, and I don't have any knowledge of like Chinese history or Japanese history or generally like East Asian Pacific history, no knowledge or understanding at all. But having this grounding in ancient Near Eastern history really has opened up the world a lot and opened up, challenged some like preconceived assumptions that I had going in as a 19-year-old, and shown that really there are some fantastic, very advanced civilizations living and like being, not necessarily being scientists, but using scientific concepts and mathematical theorems that we previously attributed to the Greeks. This stuff goes way, way, way back. And it's so amazing to me to see human ingenuity on a whole other level that I had no idea even existed. So I think it's definitely given me a much wider appreciation for ancient culture as a whole, instead of just having this very myopic focus on the classical world.
So you said earlier that there are some intersections between the Greek culture and the Mesopotamian culture, if I'm not mistaken. What are the examples?
So you get not necessarily direct transmissions. I'm not saying that the Greeks went to Mesopotamia and like adopted a bunch of their gods, or that the Mesopotamians went to Greece and were like, here's some stuff. You get a lot of ideas being traded along with physical objects. There's a very strong trade network throughout the ancient world, especially the second millennium. And you get this kind of movement of ideas from one place to another, and it kind of gets mixed up. It's really interesting. But you see things like the goddess Ishtar, who people might know. She was an Assyrian Akkadian goddess of love and warfare. And then she kind of morphs into Astarte, who's a like Semitic Levantine goddess. And then Astarte has influences on Aphrodite and on Venus. They're not necessarily the same goddess. I'm not saying that the Greeks stole Ishtar, but there are definite influences. And on the mythology and on the religion that you can see, and things like the myth of Persephone. I'm not a classicist. I can't tell you if it is something that's influenced by Mesopotamia or if it's just that this is an idea that two people had in two different places. But there's a very similar myth in Mesopotamia called Ishtar's Descent, where the goddess goes down into the underworld and then has to be kind of rescued and brought back up again. And that is often viewed as the kind of the etiological myth, the explanation for why there are seasons, why there's a period where all the crops die, in a similar way to how Persephone can be viewed with the pomegranate seeds and returning to the world for 6 months of the year. So yeah, that would be a couple of suggestions. You'd see a much more direct influence with the Hebrew Bible, and people have very successfully made the argument that it is a direct influence because you see those two cultures having direct contact. You have Israelites being taken back to Assyria as war captives, the Babylonian exile. So you have this elite class, scribal elite, essentially taken back to Mesopotamia, and then they're exposed to all of these mythologies, all of these stories. So when you see this kind of bleed through in Old Testament texts, things like the flood narrative, there's a very similar flood narrative in Mesopotamian literature. There are some very specific similarities. You have the use of the birds going off the boat to see if they find land. It's much easier to make the argument that this is actually a direct borrowing and a retelling, and what they're doing is using pre-existing Mesopotamian myth to say something about their own deity. So they're adopting it and they're changing it to say something different. In Mesopotamia, the flood narrative is showing the capriciousness of the gods and how they can't be trusted, and how willing they are to just wipe humanity out because they're too noisy. In the Hebrew version, it's used to show the strength and superiority of Yahweh and his mercy, because he is ultimately the one who saves a portion of humanity. Yes, he wipes everyone else out, but they were wicked and evil. They deserved it. Humanity doesn't deserve it in Mesopotamia. So Yahweh is justified where the Mesopotamian gods were not, and he's merciful because he stops the flood and allows humanity to kind of repopulate the earth. So you can see those similarities and that influence much, much more strongly when you're looking at Hebrew Bible.
Is there any intersection between Mesopotamia, ancient Assyria, and Hindu culture, maybe?
I don't know enough about Hindu culture to really be able to speak about that. There is contact between the two. We know that there was trade coming from the Indus Valley as early. This probably isn't the first instance, but in the third millennium BCE, we have beads and I think gold statuary. Don't quote me on that, it's been a while, that have come from the Indus Valley, and the use of kind of decorative motifs that either mean that tradespeople or craftspeople have come and settled there and made things for the Mesopotamian elites, or those elite objects have been traded into Mesopotamia. So there is contact, there is trade, quite possibly an exchange of ideas, but I don't know enough to really say for certain what that would be.
Okay. Yeah. So for context, in Indonesia, our culture influenced very much by Hindu. So I think it's fascinating if no matter how small, there is some kind of intersection between those two cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't know how much they intersect. To think that if there's even a small chance that one of our culture that and our myth or our history that we have here somehow influenced or ever influenced the Mesopotamia, I think it's quite cool. Yeah, I just think something about that. So yeah, what is your favorite myth or favorite history in the ancient Assyria?
My favorite myth. I really like a story called Inanna and Abich,
Mm-hmm.
which is a Sumerian myth, quite short. The goddess Inanna gets mad at a mountain because it won't bow to her, and ends up demanding the bull of heaven from her father, the king of the gods, to destroy the mountain. And just the absolute petulance of the goddess and her arrogance is amazing, and I love it. Yeah, and I don't know of anything kind of comparable in classical myth that kind of I don't know. Yeah, I love it. I think it's great.
Why did people make that kind of story? Assuming they create a story, not try to retell stories about a real story about God.
I don't know. It's a good question. I think it's impossible to know for certain. I think some stories are probably used to explain the existence of things, like how the world came into being, why there's annual flooding. You see those kinds of myths in Egypt, and why the seasons happen. I think there are also some myths that are just used to illustrate specific aspects of a deity's character. And I think, I don't know, that might be what Inanna Nabik is doing, because it really showcases Inanna's temper and power, and why she should be feared.
Do you have any favorite god or goddess?
Yeah, I really like Inanna. I like all of them. They're just all so interesting and so varied. Inanna is one of the ones that a lot of people choose as a favorite, because she has such a very strong characterization in the mythology. Enki is also really cool. He's like a trickster god, so he gets a lot of kind of page space, if we can put it that way, showcasing him like helping humanity out and stuff like that. So yeah, those two.
If I'm not mistaken, there is a story about Enki fighting a monster that the gods cannot tame. Uh, am I right? I heard the story from Mythvision about Enki tricking some kind of monster that troubles the gods. Am I right?
Uh,
Is there?
Enki, so he doesn't really do a lot of the fighting. He turns up in things like the Anzu myth, which is where this giant lion-headed eagle, the Anzu bird, steals the Tablet of Destinies, but the god who defeats him is Ningirsu. No, I can't think of one. That might, if it's from Mythvision, that might have come up. Enki might have come up, because he's the god who warns his favorite human about the flood, so that they can build a boat. There might be another that's escaping my mind, though. It's been a while since I sat down and read them.
How about the Anzu myth? About
Sorry, what
fighting
about
a
it?
lion-headed eagle.
Oh,
What's the story?
So the Anzu bird is the guardian of the king of the gods of Enlil, and Enlil goes into his house to take a bath, and leaves something called the Tablet of Destinies on the ground. The Tablet of Destinies is an incredibly powerful magical object. It kind of creates reality. The Anzu bird decides to steal it. He flies off into the wilderness and is causing all sorts of havoc and chaos, primarily because he's not supposed to have the Tablet of Destinies. And there's a whole sequence where different gods are asked to go and retrieve it, and they all say no, Anzu is too powerful. And eventually Ningirsu goes, and he is defeated at the first point because he shoots arrows at the Anzu bird, and the Anzu bird, holding the tablet, says, like, turn back arrows, and the arrows do what he says because he creates reality now. And what then happens is Ningirsu gets advice and is told to cut the Anzu bird's feathers off, So he cuts the feathers off, then shoots the arrow, and the Anzu bird cries out to his feathers to return to him. And because the arrows are fletched with feathers, they go straight into the Anzu bird and kill him. Or I can't
Oh,
remember if he's killed or defeated. I think he's just defeated, but the tablet is returned to where it should be.
yeah. I think that's the myth that I'm trying to find. Yeah. Okay. Let's go to the next question. What's your favorite sites, historical sites you ever visited, and maybe what's your favorite museum?
Um, I really like Ur, the city of Ur. It's got really, really interesting archaeology, some fascinating burials called the Royal Tombs of Ur, which are quite confusing stratigraphically, like looking at the different layers and the dating. But they were absolutely fascinating. There were some really interesting early theories about what they were doing there. Specifically, some of the royal burials there had pits kind of connected to them that are known as the death pits. And they were full of dead attendants, all dressed very splendidly with like harps and musical instruments and wagons and eating and drinking equipment. And the guy who excavated it, Leonard Woolley, had this fascinating theory that they had all voluntarily sacrificed themselves to join their king or their queen in the afterlife. And relatively recent CT scans have shown that actually these people were hit in the back of the head, so probably didn't voluntarily sacrifice themselves. So yes, the city of Ur is just really, really interesting, and we've got a pretty good understanding of the layout of the city as well. It's difficult in archaeology to excavate entire cities because they're so big and archaeology is so expensive. But they got quite a lot uncovered from the city of Ur.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about courses. Why there are so many courses online nowadays?
I think the pandemic had an awful lot to do with that. You've got a lot of people unable to leave. You can't go to your local college to take a general interest class. You can't go to a museum to hear a lecture. So they kind of migrated online. And I think a lot of them stayed online. But then you've also got more people who saw that there was an interest in learning from home and saw how easy it was to fill that need. So now you've just got lots of people saying, oh, like me, people are interested in ancient history, they're interested in ancient Mesopotamia, and they would like to learn from an expert. So we'll do an online course, and people can learn without having the barrier of having to go to a university, which is financially impossible for a lot of people. And even if you're going for just like a 6-week lecture series, if the lecture series is held 4 hours away, you can't go. If it's online, you can probably go, and if you can't go, there are usually recordings available. So I think the convenience and the price factor definitely have made it really, really appealing.
Do you think the trend of making courses would be go for a long time? And do you think this is beneficial, or maybe even can substitute formal academic learning?
Yeah, so people have been doing online learning for a very long time. There's something in the UK called the Open University that I can remember running when I was a child, doing distance learning. And excuse me, I definitely think it's something that is here to stay. People they want to learn. They want to learn in a way that is convenient to them, especially once you get into adulthood and you have a job and you have children and you have other commitments that mean you can't necessarily commit to a 3-year undergraduate degree. Maybe you don't want to spend 3 years studying one subject. Maybe you want just an understanding of Egyptian mythology without taking an Egyptological degree. So offering these kind of shorter, more specialized courses, I think is a real bonus for people who want to learn more but don't want to go into a specific academic field. I definitely think they're here to stay. And in some cases, they've already replaced a traditional degree. Josh, his undergraduate degree was distance learning. That was videotapes rather than watching via the internet. But people are doing it all the time. I don't think it's going to completely replace in-person degrees, but I do think that it's a fantastic way to kind of democratize access to education.
That will be all. Megan Lewis, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Sorry, I have